Hello and welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight I'm going to talk about an aspect of language that we haven't discussed on the show before, and that's semantics. Most people have a non-technical meaning for semantics, which is something like fine shades of meaning or connotation, as in, oh, we're just quibbling over semantics. I'm going to talk about semantics tonight in a broader sense and a little more technically, although on a simple level, closer to what a linguist or a philosopher might mean by semantics. And we'll see that semantic differences can be pretty basic to our view of the world. And this is all related to a point I often make, which is that studying another language can enrich your view of the world by forcing you to see it through a different lens than that of your first language that you learned. First of all, let's see how semantics fits in with some of the other kinds of structure that any language will involve. We have a chart here which shows the basic areas of structure in any language. First is the phonology, which is the area of study that looks at the sounds of a language and how those sounds may affect each other when they occur next to each other. The second area is morphology. Now this has to do with the units of meaning in a language, the minimal meaningful units of a language. You might think these would be the words of the language. Some words are morphemes, to use the technical term. But sometimes there are smaller units than the word that also have meaning on their own. The root within a word or a prefix or a suffix may have its own meaning that it contributes to the word. So morphology is about these units at the word level or below and how they combine to form words. The third area of structure in any language is called syntax, and this is roughly what most people mean when they talk about grammar. When you talk about grammar in a high school class, usually you're mostly talking on the level of the syntax. Syntax is the phrase types of a language and how these phrases are built up out of words and how the phrases combine to form sentences. The fourth level of structure could be called discourse, and this has to do with the structure of texts. Text is kind of a technical term within linguistics. What it really means is a string of usually more than one sentence, from 2 sentences up to a whole long paragraph or a speech, a story, a conversation, all of these things where you take a number of sentences and string them together into an even larger unit, which nevertheless has its own structure, its beginning and its end, and certain rules about it, about how it's formed. These are all called texts, and they all fall within the area of discourse structure. And finally, the fifth area that you have to recognize in any language, any human language, is called semantics, and that has to do with meaning in several senses. It has to do with how words and larger units represent reality. What do we call things? What word do we have for an action or a state, and so forth. And also how these meanings relate to each other, how semantically certain words or phrases seem to group together. And the way things group together is not the same in every language. In fact, the things that we have names for, the things whose meaning we choose to represent, are not the same in every language. And this is kind of the subject of tonight's show. Now, any good language course will, of course, teach some from each of these 5 areas of language structure, because if you don't cover all of the areas, you're going to be missing part of the structure of the language, which is an important part of what native speakers know. Since language is, in a sense, a set of habits that we formed as we speak the language, the person who's studying a new language then has to learn to adopt some new habits. Now let's look back at the different areas of structure again, and I'll give you some examples of that before we talk specifically about semantic habits. Okay, our first area was phonology. We said that was about sounds and how they combine and affect each other. An example that I think most people are familiar with, if you hear someone kind of making fun of a French accent, if someone speaking English with a French accent, they might say something like, I have a room with a room with, how did they say it now? I have a room with a view. And you notice there are 2 main things I was trying to do there to make it sound more like a French accent. One was to say room instead of room, because the R sound of American English is very different than the R sound of French, so you might hear a French speaker speaking American English with a French R. So the accent shows up in that way, and then the next word was with, the pronunciation with for with. And this happens because the inventory of sounds in French does not include a th sound, so often French speakers will substitute an S sound, so a French accent has S where we would have a TH in English. So this is a simple example of how you need to change your phonological habits if you want to sound like you're a speaker of the language that you're learning. Another example would be an English speaker learning, say, one of the Oklahoma Indian languages. In Comanche, the word for cat is wa'al. That has in the middle of it a consonant that doesn't exist in English. It's called glottal stop. So we don't say wa'al with just vowels after the W. We say wa'al. There's that little interruption, that catch in the throat in the middle. So an English speaker, in order to speak Comanche and not sound like they have a heavy accent, needs to learn to make that sound and to know where to make it in words. That's part of learning the phonology of Comanche. Similarly, there's a k sound in Kiowa in a word like kop, mountain. English speakers are going to tend to want to say kop with just a K, but this is an ejective type of K, to use a linguistic term. It has that extra little catch, kop. And if you want to sound like a Kiowa speaker, or as much like one as possible, you need to make that additional sound that doesn't exist in English. Similarly, in Cheyenne words, a lot of times the final vowel will be whispered, almost dropped out. It's sort of said very lightly, and that's a phonological habit that you need to adopt when you're taking Cheyenne lessons if you want to sound as much as possible like a real Cheyenne speaker. So let me give you one more kind of example of, I said that not only what sounds exist in the language, but also how they affect each other and how they may change in certain contexts. English speakers say that are learning Comanche, they might learn that the word for mountain is toya. Now that's not too hard for an English speaker to pronounce. The T is slightly different than the English T, but not very different. But then when you want to say big mountain, you can take the word pia, put toya after it, and an English speaker's natural inclination would be to say, pia toya, big mountain. In fact, when you put these two words together to form a phrase, the T of toya will change into a different sound, and you say something like piaroya. So that's a whole other kind of phonological habit that speakers of languages have, and the habits are different from one language to another. So if you want to not speak with an outrageous accent, you have to learn some of these new habits as you learn a new language. Now let's move on to the second area of structure, which was morphology. English speakers, let's think about the category of number. English speakers have nouns which can be singular or plural. In a number of languages, including, for example, Comanche, I'm going to take a lot of examples from Comanche because I'm most familiar with it. In Comanche, you have not only a singular category, so that you can have a singular noun, and a plural, so that you can have plural nouns. The same goes for verbs, by the way, in Comanche. But you also have dual nouns and dual verbs, which you use when you're referring to just two people or two things involved in something. So, for instance, in Comanche, if you want to say go away, if you're talking to one person, you say mia. If you're talking to two people, you say miawak. If you're talking to three or more people, you say miaaka. So we have three separate forms of the verb depending on how many people you're talking to. In English, we have the habit of thinking of the verbs as being either singular or plural, and a lot of our verbs don't change in some ways anyway, whether they're singular or plural. So we have to form a new habit of thinking of verbs as having three forms according to the number they refer to. So there's a morphological habit that we need to pick up if we want to learn Comanche and learn to speak it well. Going to the third area of structure, syntax or grammar, meaning the structure of phrases and sentences. People who are learning English as a second language, one thing that you'll hear a lot of foreign speakers do in English, which points them out as not native speakers of English, is that there's a structure that's sometimes called verb plus particle in English, which foreigners, if they haven't been specifically taught about this, they tend to mess it up. So we have a lot of verbs like go away, pick up, take off, put on, which consists of a verb and then another little word called a particle that comes after it. Now the thing that's tricky about this is the way the word order can change in English sentences depending on the object of the verb. And I don't want to get too heavily into English syntax here, but consider this fact. We say, I'm going to call up Joan, meaning call her on the phone. Or you can say, I'm going to call Joan up. Either word order works, call up Joan or call Joan up. But then maybe later you'll refer to that and you say, well, I did call her up. You would never say, I did call up her. But foreign speakers often say things like, I did call up her. And they have the word order a little bit wrong because they don't know that there's a certain regularity to how you can vary the word order with these verb plus particle constructions. If they want to learn to speak English and not sound like foreigners, somebody has to give them a little lesson in how that works. And that has to do with whether the object is a pronoun or not. But it's a new kind of habit they'll have to form in order to speak English in an authentic kind of way. Similarly, when English speakers are learning Comanche, they would tend to use their old habit of word order within a sentence of having the subject, then the verb, then the object. So in English we say, for instance, actually there's no subject in this sentence the way I have it written in my notes here. We say something like, good to see you. My point is that the you comes after the see. The object comes after the verb. Good to see you. But the same sentence in Comanche can be made up of, generally it would be made up of 3 words, tsata, bunin. Tsata means good, but does not mean to see. It's not in the same order as it is in English. We say tsata bunin, which literally is good you to see. So the word order is different in Comanche, and if you use the English word order when you're speaking Comanche, you're going to sound a little goofy or foreign or incompetent at the language. So again, there's a new habit you need to learn if you want to speak Comanche well. And likewise, a Comanche speaker who was learning English has to learn the reverse, to put their object usually at the end of the sentence instead of before the verb. Okay, let's go to the 4th area of structure, which is discourse. Now, there are so many different things that fall under discourse when you tell a story, certain types of song, singing, conversations. These all have their own structure, and that varies depending on what type of text it is or what type of discourse it is. But just to take one quick example, again using English and Comanche, in an English story, say a children's story, we typically start with something like, once upon a time, there was a little girl named Red Riding Hood, for instance. Now in Comanche, there's a similar formula you use at the beginning of a text of that type, like a children's story, and you use it in a lot of stories, and it sounds like so vesakutsa, ka walsa. So vesakutsa is sort of like saying once upon a time. It really literally means a long time ago, so they say the following, and then you launch into the rest of the story. So vesakutsa is a typical beginning of a Comanche story. If you tried to say literally once upon a time, a Comanche speaker wouldn't even know what you were doing. It would just be nonsensical. So the formula for an English text of that type is different. It not only has different words because they're English instead of Comanche, but the words have a little bit different meaning. In other words, the ritual beginning of a story is very different in English than it is in Comanche. So again, that's a new habit you would have to learn if you wanted to be able to tell stories in Comanche as a former English-only speaker. Okay, this brings us back to semantics again. And I think really this is, in a way, the hardest kind of habit to change. It's pretty easy to get a lesson into how you make your R's different in French, or you can be taught how to make a glottal stop for Comanche, or to do those kind of L-type sounds that they have in Creek. You can also be taught to put your object before the verb instead of after. You can be taught, say, for Comanche, that you have postpositions instead of prepositions, so you say something like table on instead of on the table. These things, you can have a little lesson and pick them up pretty easily, but I think in a way, picking up new semantic habits is more challenging because it has to do with meaning, and we kind of have this idea that the meaning is the reality that the language is talking about, and it's hard to believe that reality is different to a speaker of a different language, but in a way my point tonight is that language and reality kind of shape each other in a way, and what we think of as reality or objectivity from an English-speaking point of view may actually be organized rather differently in the mind of a speaker of a different language. So sometimes we're surprised to find either that a word doesn't exist in a language. We want to know, how do you say, gosh, I don't know, beatitude in Cherokee? And you might find that a lot of native speakers tell you, well, we don't really have a word for that. And that might seem surprising. That's a kind of semantic surprise. There's a lot of abstract nouns that people have trouble sometimes translating into other languages. English seems to be very fond of abstraction. Another thing that we might find is that when we hear a word in another language, we can't seem to find the word for it in English. Other languages, say Comanche or Cherokee or Delaware or whatever, there may be a word and we kind of know what they're getting at, but if you were trying to translate the sentence, you couldn't come up with an exact English word that corresponds to that, because English isn't dividing up this reality, the meanings in the world in the same way that the other language is. There isn't always a one-to-one match there. And so there are problems in translation sometimes because people have different units of meaning for different things that their language recognizes. So thinking of things as existing or not existing is a kind of semantic habit that we have depending on what language or languages we speak. There's also another thing about semantics. When you compare the semantics of one language with the semantic habits of another language, and that is the way a word may group with other words or phrases that might imply certain connections between things. Let me give just a brief example of this. There's a word in Comanche, taiwo. If you just ask somebody what does Taiwo mean, they'll say that's the word for a white person. But then as you study more Comanche and learn words for other ethnic groups, I was kind of surprised to find out that almost every other ethnic term has Taiwo in it. So that a Chinese person is a kuexi Taiwo, and kuexi means a braid. It's referring to the braid on top of the head that it was, I guess, Comanche's first image of a Chinese person. You've got Yu Taiwo, which is a lard Taiwo, which refers to Mexicans. They were first, the most prominent thing people noticed about them was that they used a lot of lard in their cooking, I guess. And you have other kinds of Taiwos. That doesn't really mean that a Mexican is some kind of white person to a Comanche. In fact, I think the whole semantic area of ethnic groups is just divided up differently. You have Comanches, Namana, then you have other Indians, Atavitsina, and then you have white people and other alien outside groups, Taiwo, and you can sub-specify which type of Taiwo. Is it just a Taiwo, which is a white person, or is it the grease Taiwo, or the black Taiwo, or the braid Taiwo? And so the whole area of reality is just sort of looked at differently by the Comanche language. So suddenly we're confronted with a disturbing surprise, or it can be disturbing to you kind of on some mental level, and that is that maybe our reality isn't really as effective as we thought it was. It's just one of many possibilities of how you can look at the world and divide it up into units of meaning. Now, I'm going to talk about a few different areas tonight. We'll have to hit on these briefly. As usual, when we talk about some kind of technical things, I'll just try to give you a little taste and a few examples from different languages. And I hope to encourage you to observe your own language or a language that you may be studying a little bit more closely and look out for these kinds of semantic habits in the language that you're studying. Let's talk just a little bit about color terms. Students of Oklahoma Indian languages are often surprised to find out that their teachers don't really have a word for certain colors. So for instance, a person may write down a list of color terms and say, I want to find out how to say all the colors in Comanche. So I want to know how to say black and white and yellow, and you might find translations for all of these and you're happy. You think, okay, I'm heading down my list. And then maybe the next word on your list is pink. And the Comanche speaker says, well, we don't really have a word for pink. I guess we could kind of say light red or whitish red or red like that rose over there. Or we could maybe, we could find words for it, but we don't have a basic word that means exactly pink. We'd have to come up with a descriptive phrase. And that can be kind of surprising, and you might think, well, maybe the speaker just doesn't know all the words in Comanche. There has to be a word for pink because there's things that are pink. You've got to be able to talk about them, right? An English speaker might actually get rather stubborn about this and say, you have to have a word for pink. In fact, most languages in the world don't have a word for pink. As a basic color term, English is unusual in having one. Another thing you might find as you go through your word list of the colors in Comanche is that when you ask blue and when you ask green, you're going to get the same answer. Because in Comanche, there's the same term, evita, is used for both blue things and green things and all the shades of blues and greens. It's just one color term rather than two separate ones. Of course, this doesn't mean that Comanches can't see a difference between blue things and green things. It's just that the difference isn't as important to the Comanche language or to speakers of Comanche. It's not encoded in the language with separate words as it is in English, blue versus green. In Comanche, it's as if blue and green were two shades of evita, just as in English, aqua and navy are two shades of blue. It's just a slightly different organization of the whole color spectrum. We could also talk about kinship terms. Let me flip my page here and show you one way that people have represented kinship. You can draw these kind of family trees where this is a symbol for male and this for female, and the triangle represents ego. In other words, this is yourself. So the people on the same level as you, the male and female people, are your brothers with these symbols and your sisters. And if we take the convention then that the ones to the left were born first and the older siblings, that you get older and older as you move to the right, then here's your younger sister, your older brother, and so forth. And then you can go up here, and when you have an equal sign, that represents a union or a marriage. So a man married a woman, that was your dad and your mom. They each had brothers and sisters, who in English we think of as aunts and uncles. And then each of their families, of course, had a mother and a father, who are your grandparents, and so forth. So in English we have self, brothers and sisters, mother and father, aunts and uncles, grandfathers and grandmothers. And those are our basic kinship terms. Now, in a lot of the Indian languages of Oklahoma and in a lot of languages around the world, you have sometimes more terms in some areas of the kinship and sometimes fewer. One thing that's common in several languages of Oklahoma that I know of for sure is that there will be a different term for this sibling than for this one, because you have a special word for younger sister versus older sister. It's not a phrase like where sister is common to both, but a completely separate word. And similarly, you may have a separate word for younger brother and older brother, completely separate words, not related to each other in any way, which suggests that people kind of think of their younger brother and older brother in very different ways, as if they were a different relationship to them. Mother and father, all the languages I know of have a separate word for mother and father, and there's only one kind of word for each. But then when you get to the aunts and uncles, in some languages you have a different word for the uncle on your father's side than the uncle on your mother's side. In some languages it may depend on whether this uncle is older or younger than your father, or whether this aunt is older or younger than your mother, and all these other factors come in. And up at the grandparent level, in Comanche, for instance, you have 4 terms for grandmother. You have one that means for grandparents, one that means maternal grandmother, one that means paternal grandmother, one that means maternal grandfather, and one that means paternal grandmother. So you have the 4 separate terms for the 4 separate grandparents. So again, we have, obviously, we all have family trees that we belong to. We all have parents and siblings and these kind of relationships, the way I've represented them here, but we don't all divide them up the same way and have the same number of words for them, and we don't all attend to the same factors when we decide what to call somebody. So that's part of our semantic habits too. Gender is another area of semantics. We think of gender as being male and female. One reason is because in English, in grammatical gender, that's really about all we have to worry about. We have he versus she versus it, male, female, and neuter or neutral, or whatever you want to call it. So we have 3 kind of things we need to worry about if we want to choose the right pronoun, for instance. We don't want to say he when we're talking about our mother, or she when we're talking about a male animal, and so forth. We have that kind of habit that we take note of what the actual sexual biological gender is, and we use a different word depending on what the gender is. Now, not all languages do this. In Comanche, he, she, and it are all rendered with the same word. In Delaware, he, she, and it are all rendered with the same word. However, in Delaware, you have a different kind of gender. The world is sort of divided into things which are animate or living and things which are inanimate. And you might use a different, well, I don't know that you really use a different pronoun, but you'll put a different ending on a word depending on whether it's an animate or an inanimate word. And mostly this matches up with what's living and what's not. But as in English, there are certain exceptions. We call a nation or a ship she for some, reason, perhaps having to do with our culture. In Delaware, there are things which are not living, which are considered animate for purposes of the language, like a bucket and a spoon are animate. I don't know exactly why. Body parts. We think of ourselves as having arms and hands in English. But in Delaware, everything from your fingertip up to, I think, your elbow is considered all the same thing. It's one word. You can think of it as hand, but it includes the forearm. So again, the world is being divided up a little bit differently. And then finally, I've been talking so far about things that you can see or touch, colors, things that have physical properties. But also, let me turn over one more time to the next page. Even in abstract reality, things are not always organized in the same way in people's mind if they speak a different language from you. Here are some examples from Cherokee. I think I'd better not try to pronounce them. But they all contain the verb root eli, which has something to do with thought processes and mental things. But if you look at this list of words, I've underlined the eli in each one, and I want to thank Linda Jordan for this list of words, by the way. This is something she's been very fascinated by. Each of these words contains that root, that verb root eli, which has something to do with mental things. But look at all the different kind of related meanings you get as translations depending on which prefixes and suffixes you put on the words. This one means I think, or I think about. I think so, or I'm of the opinion. It's very similar. I wonder, now that we have a whole different word for that in English, but it's based on the same root in Cherokee. I was just now thinking, a curious thought of mine. I'm curious, I worry, my beliefs. She or he decides, she or he is concerned. They are all slightly different forms, but they all contain the same root. So there is something semantically held much more strongly to be in common between thinking and wondering and worrying and believing in Cherokee, I think, than there is in English, because they all kind of group with the same minimal unit of meaning, or the verb root there. We're just about out of time, so let me just close by saying one brief caveat. I don't want anyone to be misled into thinking that a language that has, say, 5 basic color terms like Delaware instead of the 11 that English has, so that's a more primitive language than one like English. While it may have few color terms than English, there are other ways in which Delaware will have a richer system than English. So usually it all balances out in the end, and there aren't any languages that are more primitive than others. So we're out of time. I'll have to see you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita.